killed herself and died a horrible death, but each of you helped to kill her. Remember that. Never forget it. He looks from one to the other of them carefully. But then, I don't think you ever will. Remember what you did, Mrs. Burling. You turned her away when she most needed help. You refused her, even the pitiable little bit of organized charity you had in your own power to grant her. Remember what you did. Eric unhappily. My God, I'm not likely to forget. Inspector. Just used for her for the end of a stupid drunken evening, as if she was an animal, a thing, not a person. No, you won't forget. He looks at Sheila. Sheila bitterly. I know. I had her turned out of a job. I started it. Inspector. You helped, but didn't start it. Rather savagely to Burling. You started it. She wanted 25 shillings a week instead of 22 and sixpence. You made her pay a heavy price for that, and now she'll make you pay a heavier price still. Burling unhappily. Look, Inspector, I'd give thousands. Yes, thousands. Inspector, you're offering the money at the wrong time, Mr. Burling. He makes a move as if concluding the session, possibly shutting up a notebook, etc. Then surveys them sardonically. No, I don't think any of you will ever forget. Nor that young man, Kraft, though he at least had some affection for her and made her happy for a time. Well, Eva Smith's gone. You can't do to her any more harm, and you can't do her any good now either. You can't even say I'm sorry, Eva Smith. Sheila, who is crying quietly. That's the worst of it. Inspector, but just remember this. One Eva Smith has gone, but there are millions and millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths still left with us, with their lives, their hopes and fears, their suffering and chance of happiness, and intertwined with our lives, with what we think and say and do. We don't live alone. We are members of one body. We are responsible for each other. And I tell you that time will soon come when, if men will not learn that lesson, then they will be taught in fire and blood and anguish. Good night. He walks straight out, leaving them staring, subdued and wondering. Sheila is still quietly crying. Mrs. Burling has collapsed into a chair. Eric is brooding desperately. Burling, the only active one, hears the front door slam, moves hesitantly towards the door, stops, looks gloomily at the other three, then pours himself out a drink, which he hastily swallows. Burling, angrily to Eric. You're the one to blame for this. Eric, I'll bet I am. Burling, angrily. Yes, and you don't realize yet all you've done. Most of this is bound to come out. There'll be a public scandal. Eric, well, I don't care now. Burling, you don't seem to care about anything. But I care. I was almost certain for a knighthood in the next honors list. Eric laughs rather hysterically, pointing at him. Eric laughing. Oh, for God's sake! What does it matter now whether they give you a knighthood or not? Burling stormily. It doesn't matter to you. Apparently, nothing matters to you. But it may interest you to know that until every penny of that money you stole is repaid, you'll work for nothing, and there's going to be no more of this drinking round the town and picking up women in the palace bar. Mrs. Burling coming to life. I should think not. Eric, I'm absolutely ashamed of you. Eric, well, I don't blame you. But don't forget, I'm ashamed of you as well. Yes, both of you. Burling angrily. Drop that. There's a excuse for what both your mother and I did. It turned out unfortunately, that's all. Sheila scornfully. That's all. Burling. Well, what have you to say? Sheila. I don't know where to begin. Burling. Then don't begin. Nobody wants you to. Sheila. I behaved badly too. I know I did. I'm ashamed of it. But now you're beginning all over again to pretend that nothing much has happened. Burling. Nothing much has happened? Haven't I already said there'll be a public scandal unless we are lucky? And who here will suffer from that more than I will? Sheila. But that's not what I'm talking about. I don't care about that. The point is, you don't seem to have learned anything. Burling. Don't I? Well, you're quite wrong there. I've learned plenty tonight. And you don't want me to tell you what I've learned, I hope. When I look back tonight, when I think of what I was feeling, when the five of us sat down at dinner at the table. Eric cutting in. Yes, and do you remember what you said to Gerald and me after dinner? When you were feeling so pleased with yourself? You told us that a man has to make his own way, look after himself, and mind his own business, and that we weren't to take any notice of these cranks who told us that everybody has to look after everybody else, as if we were all mixed up together. Do you remember? Yes. And then one of those cranks walked in. The inspector laughs bitterly. I didn't notice, you told him, that it's every man for himself. Sheila, sharply attentive. Is that when the inspector came? Just after father had said that? Eric. Yes. What of it? Mrs. Burling. Now what's the matter, Sheila? Sheila slowly. It's queer. Very queer. She looks at them reflectively. Mrs. Burling with some excitement. I know what you're going to say, because I've been wondering myself. Sheila. It doesn't matter much now, of course, but was he really a police inspector? Burling. Well, if he wasn't, it must have solved the devil of a lot. Makes all the difference. Sheila. No, it doesn't. Burling. Don't talk rubbish. Of course it does. Sheila. Well, it doesn't to me. And it oughtn't to you, either. Mrs. Burling. Don't be childish, Sheila. Sheila, flaring up. I'm not being. If you want to know it's you too who are being childish, try not to face the facts. Burling. I won't have that sort of talk. Any more of that, and you leave this room. Eric. That would be terrible for her, won't it? Sheila. I'm going anyhow, in a minute or two. But don't you see, if all that's come out tonight is true, then it doesn't matter much who it was, who made us confess. And it was true, wasn't it? You turned the girl out of one job, and I had her turned out of another. Gerald kept her at a time when he was supposed to be too busy to see me. Eric, well, we know what Eric did. And Mother hardened her heart and gave her the final push that finished her. That's what's important, and not whether a man is a police inspector or not. Eric. He was our police inspector, all right. Sheila. That's what I mean, Eric. But if it's any comfort to you, and it isn't to me, I have no idea. And I had it all along vaguely, that there was something curious about him. He never seemed like an ordinary police inspector. Burling, rather excited. You're right, I felt it too, to Mrs. Burling. Didn't you? Mrs. Burling. Well, I must say his manner was quite extraordinary. So rude and assertive. Burling. Then look at the way he talked to me, telling me to shut up, and so on. He must have known I was an ex-Lord Mayor and a magistrate, and so forth. Besides, the way he talked, you remember. I mean, they don't talk like that. I've had dealings with dozens of them. Sheila, all right, but it doesn't make any real difference, you know. Mrs. Balding, of course it does. Eric, no, Sheila's right, it doesn't. Balding, angrily, that's comic, that is, coming from you. You're the one it makes most difference to. You've confessed to theft, and now he knows all about it, and he can bring it out at the inquest, and then if necessary, carry it out of court. He can't do anything to your mother and Sheila and me, except perhaps make us look a bit ashamed of ourselves in public. But as for you, he can ruin you. You know. Sheila slowly. We hardly ever told him anything he didn't know. Did you notice that? Bowling. That's nothing. He had a bit of information left by the girl and made a few smart guesses. But the fact remains that if we hadn't talked so much, he had little to go on. Looks angrily at them. And really, when I come to think of it, why you all had to go letting everything come out like that beats me. Sheila, it's all right talking like that now, but he made us confess. Mrs. Bowling, he certainly didn't make me confess, as you call it. I told him quite plainly that I thought I had done no more than my duty. Sheila, oh, mother. Bowling, the fact is, you allowed yourself to be bluffed. Yes, bluffed. Mrs. Bowling, protesting. No, really, Arthur. Bowling, no, not you, my dear. But this too. That fellow obviously didn't like us. He was prejudiced from the start. Probably a socialist or some sort of Frank. He talked like one. And then, instead of standing up to him, you let him bluff you into talking about your private affairs. You ought to have stood up to him. Eric sulkily. Well, I didn't notice you standing up to him. Bowling, no, because by the time you'd admitted you'd been taking money, what chance had I after that? I was a fool not to have insisted upon seeing him alone. Eric, that wouldn't have worked. Sheila, of course it wouldn't. Mrs. Bowling, really, from the way you children talk, you might be wanting to help him instead of us. Now just be quiet, so that your father can decide what we ought to do. Looks expectantly at Bowling. Bowling, dubiously. Yes. Well, we'd have to do something.